Yes! Hi guys and girls. Another bit of raw therapy advice for you. And today what we're going to do is look at curves, because it's a question I've been asked quite a few times over the last 3-4 weeks since I started doing these raw therapy videos. And yeah, people sort of can't get their heads around why there's two curves. So we're going to explain why there's two curves, but we're going to explain a little bit more. We're going to look at the curve types and the sort of curve modes, if you like. And the other thing we're going to do is look at this, the histogram. Now, everybody who's used to any other raw processor or Photoshop even is used to a histogram. The only thing is, the histogram in raw therapy is, it's a wee bit special. It really is. And I'm not going to do a drill down onto the histogram, but I'm just going to show you one or two little things on the histogram that will prove very, very useful to you. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is start off with the old curves. And here we've got this photograph of a dragonfly. Bit of a strange colour variant of, it's appalling. I can't remember whether it's a blue tail or a common blue, but it's a colour form of one of those two species. And lovely little thing, very, very dainty. It's only about that long. We've got over here the tone curve 1 and tone curve 2 under the exposure tab, and I'm using these macro images in the previous video and in this one because they illustrate the usefulness of curves when you've got an image which is fundamentally very, very fine high frequency detail surrounded by an absolute boatload of low contrast, low frequency detail, vis-a-vis this very smooth background. We all need to use curves, and I'll just tell you something about curves, which nobody on YouTube ever tells you. Virtually everything you can do to an image, be it in Lightroom, Raw Therapee, or indeed Photoshop or anything else. There's loads of different adjustments you can do, and they all go under the different guises of different names, etc., etc. But they're all, at the back of it, curves adjustments. They're either global curves adjustments, individual channel curves adjustments, or individual tonal range adjustments and localized adjustments within your image, be they based on tone or colour. But they're all a damn curves adjustment at the end of the day. Curves adjustments drive every other adjustment in Photoshop, Lightroom, Raw Therapee, etc. that isn't called curves. Yes, it does. Well, nearly every one of them anyway. So, just to get back to curves and try and keep this all nice and simple, we have linear, standard, flexible, parametric, and my personal favourite, control gauge. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one. Now, linear doesn't make any difference to your image. In other words, the curve is turned off. So linear is of no interest to us. Let's go to standard. Now, a sort of standard tone curve like this you might think is quite familiar. You can see we've got a general histogram of the image as it is now, sitting here in the background. And the thing about a standard tone curve is this. If I sort of grab one point and lift it up, yes, we get a Bezier curve coming from our highlight point down to our black point through this point we've just put on. Now, if I go and put another point on the curve and drag it the other way to make an S-shaped sort of contrast increasing tone curve, and you'll notice saturation's gone up as well, but we'll come to that in a minute. If I was to then go and put another point on, you can see as I move that, it has a really big effect on all the rest of the curve. And it's very difficult to control a standard sort of cubic spline curve such as this. Very, very, very difficult. So we'll just neutralize that curve, and then we'll go on to the flexible curve, and we'll try and emulate the same adjustment as we did before, rather like that and like that. Okay, so we've achieved fundamentally the same result as we had before. However, if I now go and put a third point in there, you can see that as I move that third point up and down, it doesn't have the same effect on the rest of the curve. It has a subtle effect, but nowhere near as great as the standard curve. It's a little bit more constrained within the local adjustment area that you're trying to adjust. We will now re-zero that curve and put it back to linear. In other words, it has no effect on the image. And then we'll go and have a look at the next type of curve we can have, which is parametric. Now, you've got access to both a normal standard cubic spline curve inside of the likes of Lightroom, but you've also got access to a parametric curve. Now, a parametric curve, just in case you don't know where they are in Lightroom, let's go and open this image in Lightroom. And we've had to do a load of adjustments to get it to look like that. If I hit reset, there's Lightroom's initial demosaicing of the image, and it's bloody terrible. But if we come to the tone curve, you can see we've got our usual, as you've just seen, a cubic spline curve. But if we click here on this little square inside of Lightroom, we can change it to what you call a parametric curve, where we can set the highlight range, we can set the shadow range, and then we can come in and make individual adjustments to the highlights and the lights and the darks and the shadows themselves. And you get this little grey area coming over the curve, which shows you what area of tone or what tonality you're going to be adjusting. So you've got access to the parametric curve, which works on top of the normal standard sort of tone curve that you're used to, vis-a-vis that one. The two of them work in parallel. They don't cancel each other out, which I think is where a lot of people get confused about the two tone curves in Raw Therapee. And so we'll switch back to Raw Therapee, where we've got a far better looking image. And similarly, we can set the position of the highlights, we can set the position or our desired position for the shadows, and we can fundamentally change the shadows, make them go darker, we can make the darks go darker, we can make the lights go lighter, and we can bring the highlights up if we want to. Alright, so that's a parametric curve. I hate parametric curves, I just don't like them at all. I've never ever once found a perfect use for a parametric curve. Never. Not in all the years I've been processing images. So we'll just go and re-zero that, and we'll come to my favourite curve type inside of Raw Therapee, which is the control cage. Now I'll just re-zero that. The control cage is a different beast altogether. Let's go and do that self-same adjustment, or try and replicate the adjustment we were making before. And you can see I've created a new point, but you'll notice the curve doesn't pass through that point. It passes much lower down. It's a much more subdued and subtle adjustment. And if we then go and try and emulate that S-shaped curve again, There's fundamentally the same curve, but it's a lot more gentle. It's a lot smoother. And you'll notice we've got these dotted lines here between this point here and this point here. What it's actually doing, there is a straight line running between these 2 points, but then it tails off. In other words, it's more favourable to keep in contrast, because what you have to remember is with any curve, if you flatten the gradient of the curve, you actually reduce the contrast. And if you flatten it out completely, like a flat curve, you lose the image in its entirety, because it then all becomes the same tonal value. In other words, you've removed all the contrast from it. So we better go and re-zero that. And so this is why I like control cage curves, because they are very, very gentle. You can go quite crazy with them and not go over the top, and it maintains, wherever possible, a straight line, but it bezieres things in a very, very smooth and graduated way. So those are the fundamental types of curves that you can use inside of Raw Therapee. But now we come to the actual modes. Now you can think of the curves modes, which is standard, weighted standard, film-like, saturation and value blending, luminance and perceptual. For those of you who are Photoshop savvy, I'm probably going to get in trouble with Ingo and all the developers of Raw Therapee for saying this, but you can think of these like blend modes in Photoshop. They're not, but you can think of them as blend modes, but they're not like any blend modes that you are used to in Photoshop. But, you know, if you put a curves adjustment layer on to an image and you steepen the curve, you put an S-shaped curve onto a curves adjustment layer and you leave it in the normal blend mode, it increases the saturation of the image as well as the contrast of the image. If you then put it in the luminance blend mode, then all the colours go back to where they were. You don't get any saturation increase, you just get a tonality, a grayscale increase in contrast. So you can think of these like blend modes, but they're not. So if we have this curve that I've just put on, which is a little bit on the aggressive side, if you have it in the standard blend mode, we've increased contrast, but we've also increased saturation. Now, I'm going to just break here, because what I want to do is to now bring in the histogram part of this lesson. As I said, I'm not doing a deep drill down into the histogram, because there's a lot of useful things about the histogram in Raw Therapee. It's a lot more extensive and a lot more technically revealing about your image than any histogram I've ever come across, at any rate. But if we go over to the histogram, what I'll do is I'll just widen it out a little bit so we can sort of get a better view. So this is where we're looking. We've got, if I turn these buttons off, so we've got nothing in the histogram. There's the red channel of the image as it stands at the moment. There is the green channel, and there is the blue channel. There is a little button here which says, when you hover over it, it says toggle between linear, and log scaling. Now, anybody who's been watching the government graphs for COVID-19 will actually know the difference between linear and log, because log curves make things look a little bit lower than linear does. So if we were to use a linear scale for this histogram, then it would be quite tall. My advice is to have it in log. It makes a lot more sense. The histogram is a bit more usable, and it actually ends up being divided into stops. we can see we've got these little icons. As I click this, that, when it's split on a 45-degree diagonal, that is linear. That is log linear, where we've got a curve in the icon, and I do wish they were bigger, or I wish it would say up here somewhere what you were looking at. But if we now press it again, so we've got this lower white portion, a smaller white portion, then we are actually in log. The useful things on the histogram are this grey button here, which if I activate it, that is the image as it stands at the moment. That is the L channel of a lab conversion of the image, or a lab model of the image as it stands at the moment. So this is a little bit like the composite histogram in Photoshop or Lightroom. The other thing we can do though, see this little yellow button here? If we hit the yellow button, then we'll get this fourth histogram come up. Well, fifth actually, if you count the lab one, and it's in yellow. That is a histogram showing the distribution of the chroma of the image, the colour of the image, the colourfulness of the image. You can take that as an indication of what are the most saturated tones, or the most colourful tones within the image. So when you go and make subtle adjustments, if it's difficult for you to see if you've had an effect on saturation, then that little yellow histogram will actually show you. So if I just go back one to before I put this curve on, or if I just go and turn the curve off instead of going back one step in the history, if I go and turn the curve off, you notice how the entire histogram shifted, but also the colourfulness or the chroma of the image has shifted, and it's also been slightly redistributed. So I'll go and put a control cage curve back on, like that, like that, get it passing through the mid-tones. I mean, as I said before, it is exaggerated. So this is in standard curve mode. So we've got a distribution of higher contrast within the image, but we've got an increase in saturation. The other thing is, when you're processing something with an awful lot of smooth graduations in, like a sunset image, this standard curve mode can actually give you some quite significant hue shifts within the delicate graduations of, for instance, a sunset sky. And so it's not really a very good mode for a curve. If we go to standard weighted, or weighted standard, now you'll notice there's a massive difference between the actual saturation of the colours, especially in this smooth, low contrast area. If I just go back again so you can see, there's standard, and notice this yellow histogram here. If I change it back to weighted standard, you see how it climbs a little bit, but it's not quite so light. So it moves a little bit to the left and goes up a little bit. So it's still colourful. We've had a colour increase, but we haven't had such a big change. If we think back to this HSV reading here, now remember we did actually look at the HSV equalizer last week, hue, saturation and value, liking value to luminance or brightness. What this weighted standard has done, if we go back to standard again, we just go and apply it again, it's actually biased towards the original V values within the image. So it has increased saturation a little bit, but not as much. But it hasn't affected the lightness values. What it's done, it's shifted the contrast, but it hasn't produced quite such a colour shift. I'm going to put it back to standard again, because this is the one we should judge all the other modes against. So we just put that back in standard, and then we shift to film-like. You can see in this particular instance, it's not really made a lot of difference. Now, on a different image with a different distribution of colour, and perhaps even a different distribution of the frequency of detail, in other words, not quite so much or such a big expanse of low frequency, low contrast detail areas in the image, can very well give you a completely different result and result in a considerable jump in saturation. So you have to remember that these various curve modes don't always give you exactly the same result in every image, which is why you need to learn to play around with them and experiment with them, and you'll get a feel for which mode will do what to a particular image, and you'll also certainly start to develop your favourites. So if I put it back to standard again, and then we come down to saturation and value blending. Now, saturation and value blending is a very, very useful, and it is one of the ones I turn to quite regularly, because if I just turn the curve off, it doesn't really make a massive difference to the levels of colour in the image, but it certainly makes a massive difference to the amount of contrast in these areas of higher frequency detail. So we'll just switch back to standard again, and we'll come down to luminance. Now you notice there was a big jump in the position of this chroma histogram. We'll go and do it again, go back to standard, and then come to luminance. Now that is very much like putting a curves adjustment on in Photoshop, or a curves adjustment layer in Photoshop, and then putting it in the luminance blend mode or luminosity blend mode. Very, very, very similar. And fundamentally, I find that the luminance blend mode sometimes actually works or feels nicer or looks nicer than weighted standard. Weighted standard is one of my go-to curves or curve modes. So is luminance. And lastly, I should say, there's standard and here's perceptual, which is supposedly the one that does zero colour change. There is the completely unadjusted image. There is the image with the contrast adjustment in the perceptual blend mode. On this particular image, to me, it is bumping the saturation just a little bit, because if I switch from perceptual back to luminance again, you see what I mean? It looks a little bit less saturated. So the three curve modes that I suggest you look at or keep in mind are weighted standard, luminance and perceptual, with a control cage type curve. Alright, so I'm just going to apply what I think is a nice curve. So I'll re-zero that. I'm going to put it back in this standard blend mode, if you like. Shouldn't have said blend mode, but well, there you go. I'm just going to put a simple, subtle S-shaped tone curve in there. And so we've got an increase in saturation. So I'm just going to drop this into the perceptual blend mode. Or am I going to drop it into the luminance blend mode? I'm going to leave it in the luminance blend mode. So this S-shaped curve here is having virtually no effect on the saturation of the image, but it's having a big effect on the contrast of the image. Now then, here's the thing. what we can do is bring in a second curve, and I'm going to pick a control curve again, and I'll just re-zero that. As I said, my favourite curve is the control cage, but if you go into Rawpedia, they put all sorts of things in there about the control cage. And, you know, if you've got sort of 5 points on, you can actually really control and create lots and lots of straight lines on the curve. I actually never, ever, ever use more than 2 points on a control cage curve. Never. Because I've got the option to bring in a second curve. Now, a lot of people seem to be confused about the existence of this second curve, because maybe they think if you do something to this curve, it'll cancel that curve out. No. No, 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 nada, won't. This curve will make adjustments based on the adjustments that are made here. So in other words, this curve has a compound effect on the image based on what's happened in this curve. Yeah. So it's a cumulative thing. So what we can now do is, seeing as we've done a curves adjustment here, which is a very, very subtle S-shaped curve to control contrast without making changes to colour, now we can make changes to a little bit of contrast and more colour in this instance, in this second curve. So we could go and apply another curve, rather like that, and then drop that in maybe film-like, or weighted standard, or saturation and value blending. That looks a little bit harsh, so what we'll do is we will really drop that curve down. Okay, something like that. Let's turn it off. See, the image looks nice, but it looks a little flat. If we just go and put a very, very subtle curve on there now, and it just adds that little bit of pop to it. It's not really doing much for the colour. We could possibly go and drop that in film-like and just give it a little increase in saturation. If I go back to where were we, saturation and value blending, watch this yellow histogram here. If we drop it back into film-like, it actually moves the histogram slightly to the right, which is making more of the lighter tones just that little bit more colourful. But it is dropping slightly in exposure or in vertical pixel count for each tone. So what we could do is maybe just brighten the image up just a little bit, rather like that, and I think that looks really, really cool. So if you're struggling to fundamentally see what's going on with colour and with brightness, what you can do is actually turn off the red, green and blue portions of the histogram, so you can just look at the luminance and the colourfulness. There's a bit of a strange do, and you can't do that in Photoshop, and you can't do that in Lightroom. I don't think you can do it in Cap 1 Pro or anything else, to be quite honest with you. So there you go. All we've got left to do to this image now is just blow it up to a 1:1 view, sort of pull it down a little bit so we can see what's going on. Come over to the demosaicing panel. I'm going to switch out from Amaze to Amaze plus VNG4, because remember, VNG4 is more favourable to demosaicing these low contrast, low frequency detail areas. And then I'll just go and drop the capture sharpening on, and there we go. I'm quite happy with that image. I'm trying to keep it realistic and as lifelike as possible, and to be honest with you, I think we've succeeded quite well. we could go into the colour tab and then turn on the HSB equalizer. I need to go into S for saturation. I might want to just increase the saturation of the reds and increase the saturation of the yellows a bit to give us an overall increase in saturation in these little red flowers here. And then I might just want to decrease the saturation of greens ever so slightly just to try and keep this background under control. And yeah, there you go. Hope you've enjoyed that, guys. In the next video, this will give you something to look forward to. We are going to be looking at these babies. Lab adjustments. Now, somebody did ask me why I favoured the HSV equaliser as against lab adjustments. I don't. That was somebody put it on a comment on last week's video. I don't. But the purpose of these Raw Therapee videos that I'm putting up on my YouTube channel is to gradually wean Lightroom users onto Raw Therapee. And the HSV equaliser, as you've just seen, has got 3 levels of control. The lab adjustments, forget these, yeah? This is sort of Tin Pan Alley. The real power comes from these here. And as you can see here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 adjustments that we can bring to bear within the advanced, if you like, lab controls. So that's what we'll be looking at in the next video. Perhaps might be something else, but my main intention right now is to cover this in the next video. So if we just come back out to a fit to screen view, and we'll push all that lot back, and there we go. Yeah, Raw Therapee, curves in Raw Therapee, nice and simple. I hope I've managed to explain it properly for you. Use this video and go and have a look at the curves section under the exposure tab on Rawpedia, and I think you'll, between the video and what it says on Rawpedia, I think you'll soon get the hang of it. And don't forget, use this neat little trick with the histogram. Yeah, I mean, that histogram, very, very powerful. So anyway, there you go, guys and girls. Hope you've enjoyed that. Hope you found it useful. And yeah, if you have and you want to see more, don't forget, yes, give us a like, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment in the comment section below. Share it. I could do with the traffic. Yeah. And yeah, if you want more in-depth members exclusive articles and videos, don't forget you can always hop over onto my Patreon channel and start reaping the benefits of my membership site. Alrighty, so until the next time, guys and girls, stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you very soon. Tooroo.